All right, guys, welcome. Our 13th and final module is titled Confronting Global and or National and Global Dilemmas. Global and National Dilemmas. Well, confronting dilemmas. So this will obviously kind of wrap up some of the stuff that we've been talking about to date and just give a kind of a quick preview on the major issues we're going to be facing moving forward, as best as we can predict them. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union dominated the global balance of power. We've covered the Cold War. A bipolar world was the term that was used. There were two main superpowers. Since the 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a multipolar world has emerged. There's different power centers now, and there's different ways to measure that. We can talk about military might. We're number one with a bullet, pun intended. But in terms of economic power, which is also obviously very relevant, you can look at the United States and you can look at Europe, for example. If you take the entire European Union and combine all those countries, their economy is roughly the size of the United States. East Asia, again, you combine China, Japan, South Korea, India, you get something comparable to the United States. So there's different centers of economic and military power. It's a little more, there's more parity. It's a little more balanced out and diverse than it was during the context of the Cold War. In terms of what's going on with China, although still governed by the Communist Party, and we when we covered the collapse of the Soviet Union, it pointed out that the Soviet Union in the end moved away from communism as an economic theory and during those reforms that Gorbachev put in. And China did the same thing. They moved away from communism as an economic theory, and China embraced capitalism starting about 35 years ago, and their economy has grown quite rapidly. But they're still governed by the Communist Party. So politically, in terms of state power, in terms of censorship, in terms of suppressing organized religion, in terms of controlling the flow of information and the behavior of their citizens, China is still a communist dictatorship, but economically, they're much more mixed now. They still have some communism, but they're doing a lot more capitalism. And as you know, for the last 30 years or so, after China made this shift, our government, for better or for worse, made a decision to basically pursue free trade with China. And since the cost of labor is so low in China, that gives them what's called a uh, competitive advantage in terms of their labor costs is very low. So they're able to produce inexpensive products, which Americans eagerly purchased. And that's the situation now. And we covered earlier that we have a huge trade deficit with China because of that policy. And we talked about trade deficits and trade surpluses in a previous unit. So the wisdom of this is something for you to assess. Number one, top level, is free trade a good idea, or should we do protectionism, wherein we tax imports in order to protect our own jobs? Number two, even if free trade is a good idea, in your opinion, does it matter on who we're trading with? I regret to inform you, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, is not our friend. Okay? They're not. Does anyone remember COVID? So you might say free trade, for example, might be a good idea if we're talking about free trade with Germany or Israel or Japan. But free trade with a regime like China, maybe not. So it's a complex thing. There's lots of questions you should ask yourself because this does affect directly your life in terms of what you have access to, what things cost, where things are coming from, what vulnerabilities we have. So a very timely issue for you to consider. New communication systems at the time, these started emerging about 25 years ago or so. Satellites, well, satellites are, go back to the 50s, but, modern communication satellites. Fiber optic cables, which are laid across the ocean floor, which can carry information across the oceans. GPS networks, you all use that every day. We're shrinking the world's physical spaces. We covered this earlier in the course in the original example of, the world is getting smaller, if you remember that, with air travel, with cars, things like that. That's kind of the analog version of this. And now here's the digital version. The world's physical spaces are shrinking now to a degree unimaginable. So even when cars and trains and planes were invented, for reasons we covered earlier, it did seem like the world was smaller, but now it's even more compressed because now you don't even need to physically go anywhere. Now you can just grab your phone, open up your laptop, and immediately be interacting, whether for business or pleasure or whatever else, with someone on the other side of the world because of all this uh, infrastructure that we have now with satellites and Wi-Fi and all that stuff. In 1970, there were 7,000 corporations with offices and factories in multiple countries. By 2000, that number had increased ninefold, basically. Yeah, ninefold exactly. So let's round it up to 10 to make it simple. In 30 years, not that long, there were 10 times as many multinational corporations. What makes that possible? Well, part of it is the stuff we just mentioned here. Communication infrastructure, technology infrastructure, increased reliability of communications through the internet, better shipping, and for better or for worse, more pursuit of free trade. If you have free trade with very few barriers between countries doing business, that makes it more practical to have a multinational corporation, to have a corporation with centers in several countries if those countries basically don't have borders in terms of their economies. That makes it more practical. Corporations sought ever cheaper sources of labor. Many American multinationals closed their factories in the US. You've seen a picture of Detroit recently, and outsourced manufacturing plants to other countries. And that's been the reality for the last 30 or 40 years. And I've asked you this in a previous unit. I'll remind you really quickly, assess the wisdom of that. Our middle class is being wiped out in exchange for what? In exchange for cheap stuff from China. Is that worth it? There are pros and cons to that, obviously. The web, the interwebs, proved instantly democratic, providing ordinary people, I love this, with easy access to knowledge. So, when you think of the internet, you more than likely are thinking, maybe you haven't heard these terms, Web 1.0, Web 2.0. The internet that you grew up with is much different than the original iteration of the internet. So Web 1.0 is a term that's used for the kind of the first wave of the internet. And what you've all, in all likelihood, grown up with, and all of these social media companies that you see pictured here are examples of Web 2.0. So let me explain this really quickly, and it'll help, I think, make that quote from the textbook a little clearer. The original version of the internet, Web 1.0, was a passive experience. So in other words, when the internet first became widely available in the United States, what the huge majority of people used it for example, if you want to get your news, you could go to an old legacy news site, New York Times, CBS, something like that, if you're into that kind of thing. And, you could go to newyorktimes.com and you could read the New York Times from the comfort of your home on your own computer. You didn't need to go buy a physical newspaper, right? Well, that was kind of interesting. It was novel at the time. It was new. Oh, I can read the news right off my computer. I don't need to go down to the newsstand and buy a newspaper. Okay, but that isn't that's not that revolutionary because fundamentally the old elite establishment media corporations still controlled what you were seeing. The New York Times is going to tell you what's happening in the world. And whether you physically buy a newspaper or read their website, it's the exact same narrative. It's the same people with the same stranglehold on the flow of information. So it's a passive experience. I can go on the internet and read what elite media want me to think. Okay. Web 2.0 is entirely different. Who creates content with the modern internet? Now, you can go to newyorktimes.com if you want and read what people in Manhattan want you to think. That's fine. But now there's competition. And who's the competition? As the book so eloquently puts it, ordinary people. Who can be a reporter now? Who can start a website now? Who can have a news broadcast on the internet that might attract 1 million subscribers? Does it need to be CBS News? No, it can be any random ordinary person. And this is democratic. Anybody can go online, give their version of events, how they perceive the news that's unfolding in the world. And if people find it interesting or entertaining or engaging, whatever else, they're free to watch ordinary people rather than a small group of elite media who all think the same thing and who almost all live in New York or Washington, D.C. So there's competition now. The old elite media, Washington Post, etc., they don't like this at all. They don't like this. They don't trust, quote, ordinary people. So it's democratic, right? By definition. The question that you should consider is, because you're growing up in this ecosystem, the critique from the old legacy media of this reality, the reality that, for example, Joe Rogan gets more views than CNN and MSNBC and ABC and CBS and NBC and the Washington Post and the New York Times combined. They don't like that because they say, hey, Joe Rogan's not a real reporter. He didn't go to Columbia School for Journalism. He's just an ordinary person. And their critique is that ordinary people who are not trained to be reporters could spread misinformation. And that is, of course, a reality and a concern and something you should be on the lookout for. The follow-up question I would ask you is, look, can ordinary people who start YouTube channels spread misinformation? Of course they can, to be sure. Can the New York Times, the experts, the elites, went to all the fancy schools and are professional, quote, journalists, can they also spread misinformation? Yeah, yeah, they can. Yeah. And so it's just in the eye of the beholder. Which to you is better? A small group of elite experts controlling the flow of information or having it wide open to ordinary people? The population of the US, so immigration comes up again. The population of the US grew from 203 to 280 million. That's a big increase in 30 years. Demographers, that's people that study human populations. They predict that at some point, relatively soon, between 2040 and 2050, the US will become a majority minority nation. In other words, less than half of Americans will be of European descent sometime in your lifetime. This extraordinary shift was due to there's a huge inflow of immigrants. You can see the data here. We got some peaks and valleys. It's a big, huge plummet valley during the Great Depression and World War II, and then it picks up again. But you'll notice this is good data on this chart because it's showing you two things. They're showing you numbers, how many people are coming in legally, and they're showing you country of origin. And you can see in the 60s, there's a radical shift. For all the history prior to the 1960s, the huge majority of immigrants, country of origin, was somewhere in Europe. I think you all know that. Well, starting in the mid 60s, the the country of origins clearly radically diversify. So now there's huge numbers from Latin America and Asia and elsewhere. The book describes this as the unintended result of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. I've never understood this quote from the book. This was not an unintended result. This was the intention of that law. That law that they're referring to explicitly, specifically said, we are changing our immigration policy in order to diversify country or region of origin. That was the entire point of that law. So the diversification and the huge increase in immigration from all kinds of different places, that's not an unintended consequence. That was the intention. The law worked as designed. So I never really understood that word unintended. No, this was the point of the law. The idea that we had historically discriminated, and this is true, in terms of our immigration policy and severely limited immigration from Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And now we're reversing that policy. Fine. That was the intention of that law, not an unintended result. Immigrants who entered without legal authority stirred political controversy. So this is important, just really quickly for you to consider, because whenever people talk about undocumented immigration, there's usually, whether they're against it, for it, whatever else, there's almost always this kind of subtext that this is a new issue. There's this kind of idea that President Trump somehow invented this issue in 2016. This text from this quote from the textbook rather is referring to the 1990s. So the idea that Americans are debating immigration policy is as old as the country itself. And the idea that Americans who are pro-immigration are also at the same time very concerned about illegal immigration, that's not new. All right, President Trump didn't invent that issue. He surely elevated it and capitalized on it for better or for worse, but it wasn't new. This is something we've been struggling with for a while. Uh, and then the rest of this quote is about uh, immigration in general, whether it's legal or illegal, as since this always is and this is and always has been a country of immigrants. The question is, all right, what's the best approach for how we approach this issue? What do we want out of immigration? Do we want, what does the book say, single American culture, or do we want multiculturalism? Another way this is phrased is salad bowl versus melting pot. And it's an analogy about food, obviously. And the question is, to what degree should immigrants maintain their previous culture on the one hand, versus on the other hand, assimilating and becoming this new thing called, quote, American? How do we balance these two things? So, salad bowl, immigrants keep their own basic beliefs and way of life while adapting to the general characteristics of the culture. Melting pot theory, immigrant groups blend into the culture, adding items to the culture. So, look, this is kind of subjective, obviously, and not super measurable, but it's basically an orientation in one of two directions. Salad bowl, and if you think about if you're making a salad, right? You're taking different ingredients, and these represent uh, immigrants from different parts of the world. And so you're making a salad, right? You got your lettuce. Let's say that's the American population as it already exists. That's the base. But then you're adding ingredients. You're adding carrots, you're adding cucumbers, you're adding tomatoes, whatever. And each of those ingredients, the cucumbers, the carrots, represent, let's say, Chinese immigrants or Mexican immigrants or, Nigerian immigrants, whatever it is. And you're adding these new components into into this salad. You're adding all these ingredients and you make a salad. Okay. Here's the thing about a salad. You can deconstruct it. When you put a tomato into a salad, it's still a tomato. It still maintains its identity as a tomato. And you can, if you want to, deconstruct it. You can take that tomato out of the salad and it's still the exact same thing as it was before you put it into the salad. Okay? And so in that analogy, immigrants maintain their original separate identity of who they were before they came to the country. If we swing towards the other direction, melting pot theory is, let's say you're making a soup and you got the broth and you got the base and whatever else. If you're cooking something in a melting pot, you're making a big pot of soup or whatever. Just like with the salad, you're adding new ingredients, and these represent new immigrants. But unlike a salad where you can combine a bunch of things, but then if you want, you can separate it out again. if you're, let's say, for example, cooking a big pot of soup and you put salt into the soup, unlike putting a tomato in a salad, you cannot, once that salt's in that soup, it assimilates into the thing. The ingredients start melting together. You see what I'm saying? And you can't deconstruct it. If you're making a pot of soup and you put some salt in there, you can't take the salt out. It's now part of the thing. It's still salt, but it's lost its individual identity much more than a piece of cucumber is if you throw it on top of a salad. Does that make sense? So it's just kind of a, which do you think is more appropriate for immigrants? To what degree should they maintain their previous identity? And that's good, right? That's what makes this country so diverse that we have all these different cultures and foods and languages. That's awesome. It's a unique thing about this country. It's to be celebrated. But the danger of that is if we stress that too much, our differences, then what is it that binds us together? What is it that melts us together? So is it better that we all maintain our separate previous identities, or is it better that we downplay that a little bit and add all of these diverse ingredients to the form where they, to the extent where they join together and cannot be pulled back apart, like if they're in a big melting pot, right? One last really quick example of how you could look at this. Hyphenation. Look at the thing on the salad. Chinese, Irish, whatever. Chinese American, Irish American, Mexican American, Italian American, right? Is that how we should look at ourselves? Or should we say, no, 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 none of that. We're not Irish American. We're not Chinese American. We're not Mexican American. We're American, period. That's more the melting pot. Referring to people with the hyphenations, right? African American, whatever it is. That's too vague. That's too broad, rather. Nigerian American, Japanese American, German American. Do we want to refer to ourselves like that? Because then we're kind of stressing our differences. Or do we want to say, nope, we're all Americans? And if we say we're all Americans, that's more of the melting pot theory. So hopefully that metaphor kind of helps you picture, visualize the different approaches on this issue. And you're gonna, one of these is gonna make more sense to you than the other. In terms of the media, earlier in the course in the era of urbanization, we covered the emergence of the modern media, which is made possible by big cities and big concentrations of people. Fractious partisanship was filtered through, or many would say created by, the new 24-hour cable news networks. When I was a kid, the news was on for half an hour a night. And with commercials, 22 minutes. Now it's 24 hours. And so what are people going to talk about all day for 24 hours? Commentators on these channels increasingly abandoned their roles as conveyors of information and became entertainers and provocateurs. Are most of our media more interested in entertainment and provocation than information? I think the author is onto something here. Um, they abandoned their roles as conveyors of information. That assumes that there was a point in our history where the media was objective and just providing information. I don't know if that's true, but the second half of that surely is. Here's an example of this from after the 2020 election. The top executives at CNN were surreptitiously recorded having this conversation. Look what we did. We got Trump out. Okay. CNN director admits the network engaged in, quote, propaganda to remove Trump from presidency. How'd that end up working out for you? Our focus was to get Trump out of office. Okay. Now, look, huge portions of Americans, including, I'm sure, many of you, think that Trump's temporary uh, vacancy from the White House was a great and necessary thing. And a lot of people, including people I know and love very much, thought that it was the most important thing in the world to get rid of Trump. No problem. The question is that the job of the media to get rid of the president because they don't like the president? Is that their job, or is their job to convey information? Uh, Bill Clinton's second term unraveled when a sex scandal led to his impeachment. We covered this briefly earlier. Americans have usually defined high crimes and misdemeanors. The standard for an impeachment is involving a serious abuse of public trust. We covered this earlier, and the question was, is that really, did that rise to the level of, he should be removed from office because of, shall we say, unsavory personal conduct? The reason this came up again, it does have to do with the media and the internet. The old legacy media, specifically Newsweek, had this story. They knew about the affair and they weren't going to report on it for a couple of reasons. Number one, they claimed that it was personal and that it was not the job of the media to report about really the private sex life of the president. Ugh, really? Is that the job? So Newsweek just kind of like, yeah, we know about this, but we don't want to run with this. I mean, we didn't do it to Kennedy. It's just not, it's not appropriate, right? So they had a kind of a professional standard, according to them, where they didn't think it was appropriate to air this dirty laundry. It didn't affect the president's duties as the president in their assessment. Also, 90% of the mainstream establishment legacy media are Democrats, so maybe that had something to do with it. Either way, an early internet news site also got the story and they were going to report on it. So the emergence of the early internet forced the old traditional media to report on a story that otherwise they wouldn't have. NATO, we talked about alliances earlier in the course in different contexts. By 2010, 12 new nations have been added to NATO, and obviously it keeps expanding. More were added in 2017, 2020, 2024. We talked about why NATO came into effect in the early Cold War. When the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of people thought NATO should disappear. The point of NATO was to prevent the Soviet Union from invading the rest of Europe. And if the Soviet Union no longer existed, we don't need NATO. That's what some people argued. And the idea that NATO would disappear, obviously that didn't happen. And not only did it not disappear, it started expanding to the east. And it's at the point now where it includes not just all of the countries that the Soviet Union took over after World War II, which we talked about. NATO now includes several parts of the old Soviet Union itself. I showed you that map a couple units ago when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was 15 republics, right? Russia being the biggest. And now it's 15 separate countries. And several of those countries, which used to be part of the Soviet Union, are in NATO. So NATO not only disbanded, it expanded east up to the border of Russia and even to the point where it includes pieces of the Soviet Union itself, the former Soviet Union itself. To understand what's going on with the war in Ukraine, you have to understand this. From the perspective of Russia, Russia has been invaded from the West several times in its history. Hitler, Napoleon, the Germans in World War I, and Russia has suffered unimaginable damage in those invasions. And if you know Russian history, it makes sense that they're concerned about being invaded from the West due to their trauma from the past. And NATO is a hostile to Russia military alliance, which is right on and even in its borders. And when we started flirting with the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, That's when Russia said, enough, unacceptable, we're done with this. That's what that war is about. Doesn't mean you need to like Vladimir Putin. It means he's a rational human who understands the history of his country. If there were Russian military bases in northern Mexico, do you think we might do something about that? Do you think we might? I kind of think we might. And that's what the Russians are feeling. There are American military bases on their borders. Now, we can say, oh, he's paranoid. We would never invade Russia. We would never do anything. Well, sure, easy to say, but Hitler said the same thing. Napoleon said the same thing. So, from the Russian perspective, they can't afford to assume that we wish them no ill will. That's their perspective. So NATO, again, the Cold War conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union didn't really end. It's actually more tense now than it's been in quite a while. The 9/11 attacks we covered earlier in the last unit, I believe, about how during the 1980s, our government was training and funding essentially the very same people that ended up doing this, because at that time they were fighting against the Soviet Union, who had invaded Afghanistan. And that kind of blew back on us. The end of the Cold War left an opening for radical Islamic fundamentalists to build a movement based on fanatical opposition to Western imperialism and consumer culture. If you listen to what Osama bin Laden had to say before and after 9/11 about what he was thinking, why does he hate America? There were two basic arguments that he made. Western imperialism, as he defines it, the Americans always help Israel when they go to war. We've covered a couple of examples of that. That's true. Deal with it, Osama. But there are effects, right? People do attack us because of our support for Israel. That's part of the price to be paid. Whether you think that's worth it or not is up to you, obviously. We have military bases all throughout the Middle East and Saudi Arabia and other important Muslim countries, and he hates that. Okay. And our culture, our consumer culture, the things that we as a culture think is appropriate to put on TV is wildly offensive to huge portions of the rest of the world, and specifically to Islamic culture, which is much more conservative in terms of public displays, shall we say, of sexuality, for example. Okay. And they don't want us sending our culture into their countries. They find it incredibly offensive. All right. So bin Laden, gave several speeches and interviews where he explained from his point of view why the United States was an enemy. Partly it's our foreign policy, and partly it's the culture that we send around the world that, in his assessment, is an insult and a threat to more traditional values. The Patriot Act so we talked earlier in the course about a couple other similar things, the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War I, for example. When there is an emergency, the government will restrict your rights, whether it's World War I, whether it's COVID, whether it's the war on drugs, whether it's the war on terror. After the 9/11 attacks, Congress passed the Patriot Act, granting the administration, the federal government, sweeping authority to monitor citizens and apprehend terrorists. Give you a couple examples here of what's in the law and how it was used. National security letters are issued by FBI agents without a judge's approval. Whoa, what happened to the Fourth Amendment? The FBI doesn't need a warrant now. The same FBI that wrote that letter to Dr. King saying, if you don't commit suicide, we'll release tapes of you having orgies. That FBI now no longer needs any legal oversight. Okay. Between 2003 and 6, the FBI issued close to 100 or 200,000 of these letters, which led to one terror-related conviction. Not a great return on an investment. Sneak and peek searches is very right out of COINTELPRO. Black bag jobs, if you remember that. They break into people's apartment, steal information, and then leave. Patriot Act allows federal law enforcement agencies to conduct secret searches of Americans' home. No Fourth Amendment checks. Uh, 4,000 roughly sneak and peeks in 2010. Less than 1% of them were terror related. Okay, a couple things. Number one, look, this is a dangerous world and we need our government to be able to protect us. So let's not be naive about that. Um, but what's in your assessment, what's the reasonable trade-off between the fact that we need security in a dangerous world and the fact that we also have rights that are not supposed to be infringed upon? How do we balance those things? Very complicated question. Uh, when you give the government the authority to do something like this, they will say, "Hey, we only need it for this limited purpose to go after these really bad people." But inevitably, it'll kind of expand, right? We talked about this with COINTELPRO. You can say we're just using this to dismantle the KKK, and then it's also anti-war protesters and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and the Black Panthers and everybody else. Look at this. The FBI is going to say we need this extraordinary authority to go after terrorists. All right, well, no one has any sympathy for terrorists. Go ahead. Well, what's the problem? Look at this data. Less than 1% of the sneak and peeks in 2010 were terror related. 76% were drug related. Well, that wasn't what the authority was supposed to be for. So maybe this is the nature of power. You give the government authority to do something, give them an inch, they're going to take a mile, right? Now, I do want to point something out about that data. There is, to be sure, and you should understand this, an intersection between drugs and terrorism. Absolutely. For example, Afghanistan was the world's biggest producer of heroin. And a lot of that money from the heroin trade went to terrorists. So, you could look at that and say, oh, they're just using it for drug. Well, a lot of that drug money, look, drug dealers and terrorists are both big fans of untraceable cash. Okay. So there's surely some overlap. So that could be a little misleading. 76% drug related. You could easily make a case that many of those cases could be connected to terrorism. All right. So that is it. Just to kind of wrap up late 1990s, right up to the turn of the century and you know, kind of looking at some of the things we're going to be dealing with in the coming years. The nature of the media, the pros and cons of the internet, the pros and cons of free trade, our relationship with China. Is it wise to expand NATO? Is that going to provoke Russia? All of these things kind of are intersecting now in our timeline, and they slowly started to emerge about 25 years ago. All right, so that's it for the last unit. You are now ready for the final exam. It is my sincere hope that you got something interesting or engaging out of this course. I really hope that you did. If you didn't, I apologize, but the good news is you made it and you are done. All right, thanks for joining.